Chapter 1: Arrival and Culture Shock. The humid air hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket that clung to Ilara's skin the moment she stepped off the plane. It was a stark contrast to the dry, crisp air she had left behind in Colorado. Incheon Airport pulsed with a chaotic energy that made her head spin. The cacophony of 100 conversations colliding, the incessant beep of trolleys, and the announcements blaring in a language she couldn't understand, was overwhelming. She gripped the worn leather strap of her messenger bag, its familiar weight a small anchor in this sea of unfamiliarity. The air, tinged with the metallic tang of jet fuel and a strange, almost sweet, floral scent, filled her nostrils. Everywhere she looked, crowds of people streamed past, their faces a blur of expressions, speaking rapidly in a language that sounded both musical and sharp. She scanned the throng for a glimpse of the face she'd only seen in pixelated photographs. Ji-hyun, her pimple for the past 5 years. She'd finally taken the plunge, spurred by a longing she hadn't been able to ignore any longer. The past year had felt like a dream, her heart hammered against her ribs, a nervous drumbeat accompanying the rush of the airport. The printed Korean phrase "twAIn young haseoinus," "koche idumun elatype ni danus," which she had practiced religiously, felt hollow now. The polished concrete floor reflected the bright fluorescent lights, creating a sterile, almost surreal atmosphere. Ilara took a deep breath, the unfamiliar scent catching at the back of her throat. A wave of nausea pulsed through her. She pulled out the crumpled paper containing Ji-hyun's description, focusing on his words. "Look for someone with eyes that hold the universe and a kind smile," it said. Even through her anxiety, the romantic description made a faint smile play at the corners of her lips. Yet, as the crowd surged past her like a relentless river, the hope of a swift reunion started to slip away, replaced by a growing sense of being lost in this sprawling, vibrant yet impenetrable world. A firm hand tapped her shoulder and she spun around, startled. A man, taller than she had imagined, stood before her, a tentative smile playing on his lips. It was him. It had to be him. He radiated an energy that seemed both calm and captivating. His eyes, the color of polished obsidian, truly did hold a certain depth, and his smile, despite its initial timidity, felt incredibly warm. He was holding a piece of paper, the printed words slightly blurred. Ilara instantly recognized her name, and a pang of relief surged through her. Her cheeks flushed a light shade of crimson, heat rising up her neck. "Qualitasienus?" he asked, his voice a low murmur, a blend of gentle Korean cadence and English. His accent was thick but strangely melodic. She blinked at him, her tongue suddenly heavy, and gave a hesitant, "Yes." "You must be Ji-hyun," in her equally hesitant English. He beamed then, a full, radiant expression that lit up his whole face. Yes, I am Ji-hyun. I'm so very happy to finally meet you. Did you have a good flight?" His hand offered to her now, he smiled apologetically. "I know how chaotic it is in here." Her hand met his and his skin was smooth, almost cool. She noticed his touch lingered a split second longer, and she took in his slight frame. A dark bomber jacket rested on him, and she noted the worn-in style. "It was a bit turbulent," she admitted, feeling some of her anxiety ebb away with his calming presence. "But I'm fine. Thank you for meeting me." A small, shy smile danced at her lips as he picked up the case that had fallen to her feet, and he looked at her knowingly. "Come," he gestured with a dip of his head toward an exit sign. "We should get you to my apartment. I know you have been up for a while and must be tired." The walk from the gate to the baggage carousel felt short under the gaze of Ji-hyun as he gestured and pointed out signs to her. It all felt so foreign yet so thrilling. As they went to get her bags, she felt a sense of disbelief. She was really here. It didn't seem real. The taxi ride was a blur of unfamiliar sights and sounds. Seoul's streets unfolded before her like a moving canvas of neon lights. bustling markets, and towering apartment buildings that reached for the sky. Ilara pressed her face to the window, trying to absorb it all. The city pulsed with a vibrant energy that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She spotted tiny stalls piled high with vibrant vegetables, the smell of garlic and chili hanging in the air. Cars whizzed by with alarming speed, weaving through the chaotic streets with an orchestrated precision that defied logic. The buildings, a mix of traditional Korean architecture and modern skyscrapers, told a story of a city steeped in history and fiercely embracing the future. She caught glimpses of colorful banners adorned with Hangul characters, the strange script looking both beautiful and indecipherable. Ji-hyun pointed out some of the buildings, offering her a glimpse into the history and daily lives of the people who made their lives there. It felt almost a bit rushed, however she savored each word and factoid. Ji-hyun sat next to her, answering her many questions in a gentle voice, his occasional chuckle like a soft melody to her ears. He seemed to anticipate her every curiosity, patiently explaining the nuances of Korean culture and traditions that she would be introduced to while staying with him. His explanation on the Korean wave and their media culture was fascinating to hear. Her desire to fully immerse herself only grew stronger the more he spoke of their country's treasures. The traffic surged and he occasionally apologized to her about his less than polished English. "I have worked very hard to improve it." She gave a warm smile and said, "It is perfect, and besides, you'll have lots of time to teach me Korean." Her comment was met with a surprised laugh, and she noticed his eyes sparkle in the city's light. For a moment they caught eyes and the world seemed to slip away, until a sharp, sudden honk snapped her back to reality, and a shiver traveled up her spine as she looked back to the street view outside the window. It had all finally happened. She was here, and that made her smile to herself. The journey was an overwhelming sensory explosion that both energized and exhausted her, leaving her feeling breathless and slightly disoriented. The city itself, alive with stories and hidden pockets, both felt beautiful and overwhelming. She wasn't in Colorado anymore. This was a whole different world. Ji-hyun's apartment was smaller than she imagined, but impeccably clean, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the city outside. The muted gray walls were adorned with minimalist artwork, framed black and white photographs of cityscapes and landscapes, and a shelf lined with books. Sunlight streamed in from the large windows overlooking the bustling streets below. The scent of lavender and something citrusy hung in the air. The small living space was dominated by a low wooden table, surrounded by cushions and an adjacent small kitchen area that was also a dining area. He gave her a quick tour. Her luggage was already beside her bed in a small yet quaint room next to the living space. Her bed, small and comfortable, looked very welcoming after the long trip. "It's not much, but it's home," he said, his gaze scanning the space to see her reaction. A small gasp escaped her lips. It was the opposite of the impersonal hotel rooms she was used to staying in. "It's perfect," she said with genuine surprise, taking in the carefully placed artifacts, plants, and trinkets. The floor was warm under her socked feet. "Thank you, Ji-hyun." He smiled softly, his cheeks slightly pink. "You must be tired. Please relax, I will prepare something to eat." He moved with a practiced ease into the kitchen, opening the fridge door. The sound of his careful chopping on a small cutting board was rhythmic and soothing, and combined with the sounds of the street drifting in from the open window, formed a background soundscape that was unfamiliar, yet already feeling comfortable. She moved to sit cross-legged at the low table, looking at the different pictures. A slight nervousness washed over her. This is the place she would spend the next few months. Would they truly get along as well as their letters had implied? Only time would tell. He turned to her, noticing her looking at the space. "I like that you enjoy this space. my intention is that you will too. So if there are any changes you want made or anything, feel free to let me know, yeah. She took in his warm yet earnest face and felt a calm fall on her that she hadn't felt in a while. This was real, and this was her new chapter, at least for now. She offered a soft smile to him. It's perfect just the way it is. The aroma of warm spices and toasted sesame filled the apartment, coaxing Alara from her reverie. Ji-hyun placed a bowl of bibimbap in front of her, a colorful mosaic of rice, vegetables, egg, and meat. I thought you'd enjoy this for your first Korean meal. Please do not feel obligated to finish everything. I understand you've been traveling for many hours. Do you know how to eat this, or shall I teach you? He watched her carefully, concern etched in the lines around his eyes. The smell alone made her stomach growl loudly. He let out a small giggle at this, causing her cheeks to grow warm again. It smells incredible, and it's okay. I have seen this dish prepared on some Korean cookery shows. She gave a smile back at him. The rich textures were an explosion on her tongue, a complex mix of sweet, savory, and spicy. She made a small sound of satisfaction. She then clumsily attempted to mix everything, struggling a little with her chopsticks, which he seemed amused by. He passed her the metal spoon and fork he had set on the side of the placemat. Here, these might be more friendly. He gave her another shy smile, and she noted again the dark depths of his eyes. Thank you, she chuckled. It's absolutely delicious. They ate in a comfortable silence, the sounds of the city a low hum in the background, and only the soft clinking of cutlery interrupted the calm. After finishing, they moved to the sofa, and she noticed he kept his eye on the time on the phone. Do you have something you need to attend? She asked tentatively, the initial anxiety washing over her again. Did he need to get rid of her already? He shook his head quickly, his hands going slightly shaky. No, not at all. Sorry, it was very exciting to meet you, and I was not sure what to expect. He blushed deeply again. I thought I would be more prepared, yet you are very interesting. Alara felt a little jolt in her chest as he looked at her, his hand rubbing his knee, and an uncertain smile danced at his lips again. It was going to be okay. More than okay, she realized as the tension in her shoulders seemed to melt. She returned a soft gaze. Well, I'm glad that I could be an interesting experience. So far, Korea and yourself have been just as interesting as I hoped. Chapter 2, Building Bridges. The early morning light, still weak and watery, filtered through the gap in the curtains, painting stripes across the worn rug in Mina's small apartment. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, a silent ballet only she seemed to witness. The scent of stale coffee hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the frantic start to her day yesterday. She lay sprawled on her futon, the thin cotton sheet tangled around her legs. The digital clock on her bedside table blinked 7:03 a.m. A new day, the same weary routine, she thought, her eyelids heavy, each blink a struggle. The muffled roar of traffic seeped through the poorly insulated walls, a discordant lullaby of soul. Her mind drifted to the encounter last night, the enigmatic smile of the stranger, the intensity of his gaze. A shiver, not entirely unpleasant, traced its way down her spine. She rolled over, burying her face into the pillow, hoping to capture a few more stolen moments of unconsciousness. Her stomach rumbled, a low growl demanding attention, pulling her back to the grim realities of her morning. Groaning, she pushed herself into a sitting position, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight, a symphony of small protestations that accompanied each movement in her apartment. She glanced at the small framed photo on her nightstand, her grandfather's smile frozen in time. A surge of warmth, like a small spark in the darkness, flickered within her. He always told her to embrace each day with curiosity. Curiosity, then, she thought, perhaps today wouldn't be so mundane. With a sigh, she finally conceded to the day. She shuffled to the small kitchenette, the worn linoleum cool beneath her bare feet, and put on the kettle, the metallic clatter of the empty pot echoing in the silence. The small bakery was a haven of warm light, and the intoxicating scent of yeast and cinnamon. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating the swirling dust motes like golden rain. The clanging of the delivery truck's gate pulling down outside the shop momentarily overwhelmed the quieter kitchen sounds. The baker's counter, crafted from worn, light wood, was stocked with an array of breads, some glistening under the glaze of an egg wash, and pastries decorated with vibrant fruits. Mina moved through the narrow space, the air thick and warm, the yeasty scent filling her lungs. It was her element. She dipped her hand into a bin of dark flour, the soft, silty texture instantly familiar and comforting. She kneaded dough on a wooden board, the rhythmic thump of her palms pushing the ball down and across, a steady heartbeat in the early morning silence, only occasionally interrupted by the bell over the front door jangling as an early riser grabbed a pastry and ran off into the morning. "Mina ya," called a husky voice from the back. She didn't need to turn to know it was Aunt's song. Her apron had a dusting of white powder, her hair pulled into a messy bun escaping tendrils of gray, yet there was a lively spark in her dark eyes. "Did you remember to order the rye flour?" she asked, her voice tinged with the gruff affection that Mina had come to associate with her. Mina nodded, pushing the dough together into a smooth ball and placing it into a greased metal bowl. "The delivery should be here by now," she replied, the scent of the fermenting dough hanging thick and heavy in the air. "I told them we needed it before 7, just in case the rush starts early today," Mina said. The door's bell chimed as a man in a dark jacket carrying a large sack entered, their delivery at last. The clanking of metal against wood as he shifted the sack down onto a nearby cart, the distinct, coarse feel of the sack rubbing against her skin, and how she used the flour every morning. All her senses tuned to the daily rhythms that brought her calm. Mina began pulling open the sack to ensure the shipment was correct. Her aunt, meanwhile, was setting out a small array of still warm sesame seed biscuits onto a cooling rack. "Are you still thinking about that strange man?" her aunt said, without looking up from what she was doing, cutting out each one with a quick precision. "What strange man?" she asked, knowing full well whom her aunt was talking about. Her face turned a shade hotter as she placed the flour onto the delivery checklist she held. "The one last night at the bookstore. Your mind has been wandering since then." Mina busied herself quickly, adjusting the labels on each flour and grain she just delivered. "He was just asking for recommendations," she replied, her voice clipped, not quite as firm as she had wished. Aunt Song chuckled, the sound echoing in the small space. "Just asking, Humph. With a smile like that," she said, pulling the rack towards the door to serve the first wave of patrons. The bookstore was dim, a stark contrast to the bright bakery she had just left. The air hung heavy, tinged with the smell of aged paper and leather-bound books. Sunlight, filtered by the narrow window panes, illuminated shafts of dust. Mina moved between the towering shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines of familiar titles. The quiet was a welcome relief after the baker's bustle, only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Her eyes scanned over her usual spots, trying to gauge if the man from the night before might possibly show up. It was foolish, she knew. The city was filled with people, millions, and there was very little reason why their paths should cross again. She shouldn't want them to. Her fingertips grazed across the worn cover of 100 Years of Solitude, a book she returned to for comfort whenever things felt chaotic. She ran her thumb across the texture of the title, tracing each of the faded words. She took a deep breath, a lingering sense of anticipation mingled with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was foolish, childish. She chided herself internally, her emotions doing a clumsy two-step. This whole feeling was strange for someone she had only shared a few minutes of conversation with. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, the soft buzz a sudden intrusion, a text from her younger sister, Hannah. "Don't forget dinner at Mom's tonight and bring dessert," Mina sighed. She had been trying to get out of dinner with her family for weeks, but her mother was nothing if not persistent, a steamroller of kindness and love that Mina was still finding the edges of. She replied with a simple, "Okay." The sound of someone clearing their throat made her jump. She looked up and found him, leaning on the stacks as though he'd been there a while, observing. "Looking for some light reading," he said, a half-smile playing on his lips as though this was a casual meet, not an obvious intention. Mina felt her face turn an unnaturally warm shade of pink and swallowed. Her tongue was suddenly swollen, and the words she so desperately wanted to express were trapped in her chest. She began, her voice failing her for a moment as the surprise overtook her. "I wasn't looking for anything specifically," she eventually mustered, willing her heartbeat to settle down. He pushed off the stacks, the leather of his jacket making a soft sound, the scent of smoke still clinging to him from the cold air outside. He stepped closer, closing the gap between them until she felt the warmth emanating off of him. "It is rather large," he said, gesturing to the expanse of books surrounding them, a sly grin dancing in his dark eyes. "You said you liked reading. Did you decide to grab something after all?" He kept the tone playful, teasing. His gaze caught hers for what felt like too long. She felt her pulse flutter in response. I work here sometimes," Mina said, realizing she'd probably told him too much, but he was right, she couldn't just pretend not to notice. "Really?" He lifted an eyebrow. "You hit it well last night," he quipped, his head cocked to one side. A small laugh escaped her. She wasn't sure if it was a real laugh or something closer to an embarrassing exhale. "I only just started," she replied. She didn't quite know how to explain how she usually stayed hidden at the back, mostly to avoid the patrons. It wasn't something she felt particularly inclined to explain. "Do you like books, then?" she added, quickly changing the subject. "Well enough to get lost in one," he said, his eyes roaming over the rows. "How about I let you pick out a new title for me then?" he said, the suggestion an intriguing proposition that made the hair at the back of her neck stand on end. She tilted her head, unsure. He looked to her, waiting patiently. The faint scent of his cologne reached her, the sharp bite of citrus and woods, and was somehow addictive. "Only if you're prepared to face the consequences," Mina replied, a playful challenge entering her tone as she turned and started to make her way toward her section, an adventure she wasn't quite sure she was ready for. He chuckled, the low sound sending a shiver through her. He walked beside her, their arms brushing every so often as she made her way, the sensation causing her stomach to flip and making the space between them feel all too small. She picked out Pachinko, a recent favorite of hers, placing it gently into his hands. "This is something you wouldn't regret reading," she said, attempting to be nonchalant, hoping she hid how her heart was beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. He took the book from her hands, his fingers brushing hers again, sending another jolt up her arm. He opened the cover, scanning over the blurb before looking back at her, a smile playing at the edge of his mouth. "I trust your judgment," he said. "Is there anything else I need to know?" He asked, the underlying meaning hanging in the air, both of them understanding that this was much more than just a book recommendation. Mina took a step back, a mix of apprehension and exhilaration churning within her. She looked up to his dark eyes, taking in his intense stare that seemed to melt through her. "Just be prepared to have your heart broken," she replied, unable to suppress the corners of her lips from curving up, a small smile, shy yet genuine. "I'll keep that in mind and thank you again for all of this," he nodded, his hand slightly reaching out as though to touch her again but stopped before it crossed the invisible line separating them. Maybe you could suggest more later, he said, the implied invitation hanging thick. Maybe Mina breathed out before his gaze swept past her and shifted toward the front of the shop where the store manager, old Mr. Kim, had emerged from the back office. His steps were heavy, making the floor creak with each movement. He eyed the two of them with suspicious and knowing eyes. He glanced at Mina briefly before huffing and returning back into his office, the clacking of his heavy steps soon fading. The spell was broken. Mina cleared her throat. I should probably get back to it, she said, moving quickly towards her usual corner. Enjoy your reading, she quickly whispered before heading to the stacks. I will, he said, his voice a low hum that resonated through her. She felt his eyes follow her as she retreated. A sudden wave of nervousness overcame her. What was she doing? This was ridiculous. She needed to ground herself again before she got in too deep. She busied herself with tidying the shelves, reorganizing them even though they didn't need it. Her fingers touched the spines as her mind tried to process the last few minutes. Her breath was still unsteady, each exhale feeling shaky and unsure. His cologne, his voice, the brief touch, it all swirled within her mind, a dizzying mix of anticipation and excitement. She looked up again. He was gone. But the small thrill remained, a flicker of something new in the usual rhythm of her life. She knew this was more than she had planned for the day. The quiet rhythm had been broken. It was now a tempo filled with curiosity and just maybe a sliver of hope. Chapter 3. Confronting Reality. The cloying scent of fried garlic and chili hung heavy in the air, a pungent blanket woven through the narrow alleyways behind the market. It clung to Hana's clothes, her hair, even seemed to seep into the very pores of her skin. She hadn't slept properly in what felt like days, and the rough canvas of her backpack dug into her shoulders with each step, a constant reminder of the weight of her choices. The neon signs of the electronics district pulsed like a frantic heartbeat in the distance, a stark contrast to the shadowed, crumbling brick buildings surrounding her. She could hear the rhythmic thud of metal on metal from a nearby workshop, the occasional shout of a vendor trying to hawk his wares, and the incessant hum of Seoul's relentless energy, all swirling around her. The streetlights cast elongated shadows that danced with every gust of the cool morning breeze, creating an eerie, almost surreal landscape. A stray cat, ribs showing through its patchy fur, darted across her path, its eyes reflecting the flickering fluorescent light. Hana pulled the collar of her threadbare jacket tighter, the cheap nylon doing little to ward off the chill that had settled deep within her bones. She had to find him. She had to find Sujin. He wouldn't just leave, not without a word, not after everything. She paused in front of a small, grime-streaked map shop, the glass window smudged with handprints and age. Inside, the bell above the door jingled weakly, a pathetic sound that was barely audible above the cacophony of the alley. She caught the eye of the old woman sitting behind the counter, her face etched with wrinkles that spoke of a long life lived in these cramped quarters. "Excuse me," Hana said, her voice raspy from disuse. "Do you know, Sujin?" The woman peered at her over her spectacles, her lips a thin line. "Many come and go," she replied, her voice like the rustling of dried leaves. "What does he look like? Why you ask?" Hana tried to describe him, his dark hair that always fell into his eyes, his sharp cheekbones, the way he fidgeted with his hands when he was nervous. She pulled out a crumpled photograph from her pocket, a faded print of the two of them laughing, bathed in the golden light of a summer afternoon. The old woman looked at the picture, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Ah," she said eventually, her gaze moving back to Hana. "The musician boy. He was here not long ago. He went that way." She pointed with a gnarled finger toward the labyrinthine maze of streets to her right. "But he's gone now, for several days. This area changes people like old coins. They pass through and are lost in the process. Hana's heart sank. Several days. Where would he go? Why had he not contacted her? The weight in her chest felt crushing, almost tangible. She tried to hold back the fear that threatened to engulf her, tried to remind herself of his assurances. Did he say anything? Hana asked. The old woman shook her head slowly. Only a melody. She hummed a few discordant notes, and Hana felt a jolt of recognition. It was his, a tune he had always been struggling to complete. He had played it countless times for her on his beat-up guitar. The same one now sat alone and silent in the corner of their room. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The old woman just nodded again, her eyes returning to the aged map she was meticulously cataloging. Hana stepped out of the musty map shop and into the humid morning air. The woman's directions had been vague, like following the breath of the wind, but they were all she had. She followed the network of alleys and pathways she pointed out, trying to imprint every detail into her memory. A jumble of storefronts stacked precariously against each other. Street vendors hawking knockoff electronics, stray dogs, the smell of diesel, dust, and food blending together in a unique, but harsh fragrance. Each building pressed closely as though guarding ancient secrets and long-held dreams, each pathway offering hope and at the same time a potential dead end. She felt the rough, unforgiving stone beneath her worn shoes, each step an echo of the doubt that gnawed at her. The map shop seemed to have vanished into the landscape behind her, a figment of a memory. Further along the lane, two men squatted over a makeshift chessboard cobbled from pieces of old cardboard and bottle caps. Their brows were furrowed in concentration, the clicks and slides of the pieces creating a strange and distorted percussion. One man, his face obscured by a battered baseball cap, wore worn fingerless gloves despite the humid temperature. The other, a thin man with a wide smile exposing his tobacco-stained teeth, seemed to be on the losing side. Their language, Korean, was spoken rapidly, filled with frustration and short bursts of laughter, but their expressions were a universal language that required no translation. She watched them for a moment, seeing a sliver of normality, and thought that perhaps, just perhaps, everything might not be completely ruined. "Excuse me," she tried, using the same hesitant voice as before, this time though the men glanced up. "Do either of you," she trailed off, unsure how to describe him to strangers. She produced the photograph once more, hoping that the picture, like before, would do the speaking for her. The men squinted, and the gloved man grunted before shaking his head. "Never saw him," he stated, returning immediately to the board. The thin man took a final glance. "Seen a kid around here maybe, but not with a face like this." The thin man smiled and poked at the pieces before taking a winning strike. She lowered the photograph and tried again. "He plays music." The two men shrugged, as though that fact was unremarkable, like rain or traffic, part of the humdrum nature of the everyday. Hana left them at their game, their laughter following her like distant echoes. A faint flicker of panic grew inside her. Maybe they hadn't been the right ones to ask. Perhaps it was the way she spoke. Or maybe it was the fact that so many faces flowed through this section of the city that she needed something more than an outdated picture to get her through. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her stream of thought, and she retrieved it slowly, her hands trembling. A message, unsent, that she had tried to formulate again and again since he went missing. The light of the screen illuminated her tired face, and the battery symbol flashing red mocked her lack of resources. She tucked it away again and carried on, weaving through the congested pathways of the marketplace, the faces of strangers a constant blur, some staring back with undisguised curiosity, most looking right through her like she was a ghost, an invisible presence on the fringes of their lives. She had to keep going. He wouldn't just give up. He wouldn't let himself fade away. The midday sun beat down on the corrugated metal roofs, turning the alleys into stifling ovens. The air vibrated with the discordant melody of construction, a harsh symphony of clanging steel and grinding machinery, punctuated by the constant drone of traffic from the distant main roads. Hannah's throat was dry, and her head throbbed in time with the rhythmic hammering she had been hearing now for close to an hour. She hadn't had anything to eat or drink all day, but the thought of food turned her stomach, a sickening knot tightening in her gut. She needed answers, needed to find Sujin, needed to prove to herself that he was all right. She came to a larger open space, a makeshift car park, crammed with old trucks and delivery vans. A small group of men were clustered around the tailgate of one van, their voices rising and falling in animated conversation. The smell of exhaust fumes was heavy, acrid, and mixed with the earthy scent of ripe tomatoes, fallen from one of the trucks. A woman sat on a stack of crates nearby, shelling peas with practiced efficiency, the sound of the pods cracking open like a metronome keeping time. Hannah noticed a faded flyer plastered to the side of a truck, the image on it slightly obscured by dirt and rain streaks. She squinted to read it, her heart beginning to thump. A gig, a performance in a nearby karaoke bar called Melody's Edge only 2 nights ago. The blurry, dark figure holding a guitar, the same worn guitar she knew too well, looked vaguely familiar and filled her with new purpose. Her legs felt unsteady, but it was the most hope she'd felt since she'd been told that he had left. The woman with the peas stopped shelling to watch Hannah look at the flyer. "You interested in that show?" she asked, her voice surprisingly soft and melodious given the hard edges of her surroundings. It was terrible music but crowded for what it was. Hannah nodded slowly, her eyes glued to the worn paper. "Was he good?" she tried to ask. The woman laughed lightly and shook her head. "Good, childish I would say, but he played his soul out to an empty room of drunks and sleepy workers." She wiped her hands on her stained apron before continuing. "He was the talk of the market yesterday morning when they swept up around the square. Some wanted to sign him for next week even." Hannah's breath hitched in her throat. Signed. She finally found a lead and felt herself both relieved and terrified of the possibilities. The woman's comments swirled in her mind. What did she mean about almost being signed? She turned her head back to the flyer, the small image and address printed on it like a lifeline to be grasped desperately. Melody's Edge. She could go there. She could ask about him. The woman, seeing her determination, offered a soft smile. "It's not far," she said. "Just down that alleyway. Turn left at the fishmonger's and you'll see the bright pink sign. It stands out like a sore thumb." Hannah nodded slowly, taking a mental snapshot of the directions, already moving with purpose. Her legs moved as if on autopilot, her muscles aching but not faltering. The smell of raw fish began to encroach, an acrid, metallic scent that made her nose wrinkle. The cacophony of the market, the shouts and haggling of the vendors, faded into a dull murmur, drowned out by the frantic beat of her heart. She pushed through the crowds, her determination fueled by a potent mix of hope and anxiety. She felt close, she could almost feel him. She finally had some semblance of his movements, a possible trail to follow. A hand gently caught hers. She gasped, but didn't try to pull away as the old woman that gave her directions in the map shop had appeared from an alcove behind a fish stall. "I found him in here earlier this week, trying to find scraps of papers to write his music." She gestured into the darkened area. "Maybe you'll find answers there, but be wary. These kinds of places can eat a soul like a starved wolf." The woman gave a knowing stare. "And these places can give as much as they take, but it's not easy." With that, the woman disappeared back into the dark space as quick as she appeared, and left Hannah facing the shadowed void she had just left behind. With a deep breath, she took the first step in. Chapter 4. embracing the solstice. The air in the terroom hung thick with the scent of roasted barley and dried persimmon. Sunlight, strained through the paper windows, painted the low tables with rectangles of pale gold. Hee-won settled deeper into her cushion, the rough weave of the fabric a familiar comfort against her skin. Outside, the clamor of Seoul throbbed, but in here, a quietude reigned, broken only by the gentle hiss of steam rising from her cup. She took a slow sip, the warm, earthy liquid soothing the tightness in her chest. This was her refuge, a small, fragrant sanctuary amidst the whirlwind of her life. Today, the approaching winter solstice felt particularly oppressive, each shortening day an additional weight on her weary shoulders. The weight of her family's expectations, her failed attempt at securing the publishing contract, and the increasingly persistent feeling that her life was not her own. She'd hoped meeting Sun Mai, her oldest friend, might lift some of that burden. But, judging by the sharp click of her friend's heeled boots echoing closer on the wooden floorboards, Sun Mai was as tense as always. A heavy perfume of lilies and a sudden, unexpected chill washed into the room as the door slid open, revealing Sun Mai in a crisp black trench coat, her dark hair perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. Sun Mai's lips were pressed in a thin line as she approached, the usual sparkle missing from her eyes. "You're late," Hee-won said softly, setting her cup back on the saucer with a delicate clink. It felt a bit like poking a wound, but Sun Mai needed it. A challenge, a call back to the normal that would diffuse whatever dark mood had settled in around her friend. Sun Mai's expression tightened. "I had a meeting." Her tone was sharp, cutting. She slid onto a cushion across from Hee-won with a rustle of fabric, pulling her coat open, then off entirely, as if she were shrugging off a burden as heavy as Hee-won's worries felt. A quick shake sent her shoulder-length dark hair swirling around her face. "They keep pushing deadlines." Sun Mai exhaled a breath through her pursed lips, staring at Hee-won as if waiting for some reaction she would otherwise find in her reflection. "And I am certain I'm about to be stuck with more of the event planning for the holidays." Sun Mai's hands curled into fists on the table. "All this work, every day, and they still treat me like I am just a student assistant." Hee-won studied her friend, the way her nails dug into her palms. She knew that this rigid, put-together exterior concealed the barely contained frustration that seemed to perpetually burn within Sun Mai, a fire always threatening to consume them both. "You know you can leave, right?" The words were carefully chosen. This wasn't just a thought tossed out to ease the air, but an invitation, an offering. "There are other things, other paths, Sun Mai. You don't have to keep proving yourself to them." Hee-won's voice softened into a low hum of sincerity as she reached across the low table and laid her hand over Sun Mai's tightly wound fist. Sun Mai flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. Her gaze flicked down to the entwined hands for a second, a fleeting tenderness dancing across her hardened gaze, then back up, locking with Hee-won's. "And do what exactly?" Her voice was tight, her jaw clenched. The words almost spat into the small space like pebbles fired from a sling. "Wander the city selling old books." There was a familiar note of mockery layered into her query that felt aimed at them both. "No," Hee-won said gently, refusing to release her hand. "Do what makes you feel alive. Not like this." Her own words rang a bit hollow in the heavy air. What did asterisk make her feel alive anymore? A pang of guilt flickered in her chest at her own hypocrisy. Sun Mai finally let out a heavy breath. The fight drained from her shoulders. The air felt lighter. The click of Sun Mai's expensive heels had been replaced by her slow, measured breaths. She seemed to search for the words, like tiny moths caught in the beam of a lamp. She looked away towards the window, the gold squares catching on her dark eyes. The hard line of her mouth finally softened. I don't know how to find it." The aroma of freshly fried fish hit Hee-won like a fist as she stepped onto the covered portion of the Noryangjin fish market. The early morning air, sharp and briny, stung her nostrils. She coughed and rubbed a hand across her face, surprised at the force of the assault on her senses. The market was a chaotic symphony of shouting vendors, the screech of gulls, and the wet slapping of fish against tile. It was a cacophony Hee-won usually avoided. But Sun Mai's words from the tea room echoed in her mind. Find it, she'd said, like life itself could be ordered at a restaurant and wrapped to go. Find it. The desire to write had been dormant for too long, buried under layers of rejection and disappointment. She didn't know how to get the spark back, but a feeling stirred in her chest that the chaos around her held something for her, held a spark if only she dared to try. Rows of metal stalls displayed a kaleidoscope of marine life, glistening octopus, vibrant red snapper, silvery mackerel. Sunlight reflecting off wet scales created dazzling patterns that danced before her eyes. The floor was slick with seawater, and she had to carefully maneuver around puddles and discarded fish parts, a sour and bitter tang hanging heavy in the air. She watched as a vendor deftly filleted a flounder, the knife flashing in his hand, and another carefully arranged a pyramid of clams, their shells glistening with moisture. Even the rough hands, stained with scales and brine, were part of the experience. The visceral nature of it, the sheer life in it, was both appalling and captivating. Hee-won moved further into the market's belly, the sounds rising like a wave threatening to swallow her whole. This wasn't like her sterile apartment. The silence of a blank page or the muted colors of a half-empty studio. She came to a halt before a stall where an old woman, her face deeply lined with time and the sun, was meticulously sorting through a pile of dried squid. The smell was intense, a potent mix of salt and sea. Hee-won wrinkled her nose but found herself unable to look away. They're good, the best in the market. The old woman's voice was surprisingly strong. It rasped with a life hard-lived. She glanced up, her eyes the color of faded denim. Her gaze, however, was clear and discerning. You looking to buy or just passing through, young one? Hee-won felt caught, embarrassed at her own hesitancy. Just looking, I suppose. She stammered slightly, her cheeks growing warm under the woman's scrutiny. She didn't want to admit that she was drawn to the chaos, the very things she always avoided. To try to capture the life here when all her prior works felt so small and contrived. It's quite a sight, the old woman chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Life is a sight, she said, her tone a bit too pointed for Hee-won's comfort. She reached out a gnarled hand and pulled out a particularly thick piece of squid, holding it out towards Hee-won. You have to taste it, experience it. No matter how bitter, you must not shy from the truth of it. Hee-won hesitated. She could smell the ocean and smoke coming from it, a very pungent, almost putrid odor hitting the back of her nose. She'd never enjoyed eating it fresh, and she couldn't imagine eating it dried either. Still, a sliver of courage began to form in her throat. A piece of the alive that Sun Mai was missing seemed to be there in that simple, leathery food. If I eat this, she began, a slow drawl forming in her voice, a small defiant tilt to her lips. Will you tell me one of your secrets? The old woman raised a single, thick eyebrow. A slow, knowing smile stretched her face. Oh, my secrets. They cost more than a taste, young one. More, I would think, than you could possibly be ready to give. The narrow alley was almost completely devoid of sunlight, the tall buildings on either side blocking out any hint of the day. The walls, layered with peeling posters and faded graffiti, felt like they were closing in on her. The air here was heavy, not with fish, but with the combined smells of dust and damp concrete. A solitary street lamp flickered at the alley's end, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed in the dim light. Hee-won adjusted her worn scarf around her neck, pulling it tighter against the chill that seeped from the stone. She pulled out the small notebook, pages already slightly frayed at the edges. This place had always had a hold on her, a dark energy that drew her despite herself. This hidden place. It was just off the main thoroughfare, but a world apart. The heart of the city was a roaring train. This alley the cold, quiet track they would one day leave abandoned and rusted. She found the faded doorway easily. The chipped paint on the door was nearly the same color as the wall, an almost desperate attempt at camouflage. A heavy, old padlock, rusted and stiff, dangled open. This is where she'd come with her father all those years ago, before his long illness took him. He used to bring her here after they went to see the old books in the neighborhood shop. There was a small workshop. In a room above, he kept a trove of old writing machines he couldn't bear to part with. She had promised herself that she would return one day to see them, that this space would be her own and she would use it to make her own works, but a day had become years. She'd felt the urge lately growing in intensity. It was always a pull and a release she couldn't resist. This room always called to her when her life reached an impasse. She'd tried the bookstore, but had found its sanitized rows too clean for what she needed. There needed to be grit, dust, and even the memory of salt and brine. This space, this almost forgotten part of the world, was more welcoming to her than anything else she could remember. With a deep breath, He-One pushed the door inward, its hinges groaning in protest. The darkness swallowed her whole for a moment. A musty odor, thick with age and decay, rushed forward to greet her, along with the echoes of her memories. She reached to her small pocket for the pack of matches, her fingers trembling slightly. She struck a light. The tiny flame illuminated the small room, revealing the disarray that greeted her. Piles of dusty boxes were stacked haphazardly, their contents obscured by years of neglect. A workbench, coated with a thick layer of grime, sat against one wall. In the center of the room was a collection of old typewriters. Some broken, some with keys missing, their cases covered in layers of dust. The cold of the place wrapped around her. Each of the small silver buttons were like miniature tombstones marking a forgotten life. But there was an energy, an echo in these inanimate objects that she could feel resonating within her. It called to her again. Her chest pulsed and the thrum that she was finally home. She didn't immediately sit down. No, instead, He-One picked through each of the dusty relics, caressing the aged metal and touching the plastic of each small key. The scent of iron and age hung heavy in the space, and when her gaze caught one particular machine, she knew that the time for the stories to return had finally come. She pulled it towards the workbench, its heft, a cold, reassuring weight in her arms. He-One carefully wiped the dust off of the old Underwood typewriter. She found the power outlet in the wall behind the workbench. She fished out her phone to use the flashlight function, and connected to the frayed power cord and plugged the plug into the socket. She was shocked at how well maintained the inner mechanism seemed, almost unused. Her hands moved with a practiced ease. It was like riding a bike. That feeling came back instantly and easily as the light click, click, click sound started from within the aged casing. She found a pack of paper stowed in one of the lower cabinets and fed it in. The white page seemed too bright against the dimly lit room, a blank canvas almost mocking her hesitancy. She positioned her fingers over the keys, hesitating. A memory, clear as day, pushed forward of her father, fingers flying, words spilling from his fingertips into a page he created. She inhaled a deep breath of the dusty air, the scent filling her lungs as she finally started to type. Her fingers flew across the keys. The words, disjointed and fragmented, started to flow from her hands onto the page, a memory from her youth-found voice. Then a new perspective, almost a conversation between who she was and who she was now, began to appear. The sound of the keys clicking away resonated through the alley, and even, it seemed, far beyond it. It was imperfect. It was raw. It was alive. A small smile broke on her face, and tears started to prick at the corners of her eyes. Finally, she felt something that could actually break through the barriers and begin again. She couldn't stop herself now if she tried. She leaned forward into the glow of the desk lamp, the metallic click of each letter a drum beat pushing her further down her path. She didn't look up until the first rays of sun pierced through the high windows on the alley outside.